Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the public lecture, Justice, Democracy and the Unconditional Basic Income. My name is Alice El-Wakil and here are my colleagues Lea Heine and Lukas Peter from the DemocracyNet.eu network, as well as Christian Müller and Daniel Straub from the Institut Zukunft. As co-organizers of tonight's event, we're extremely glad to see so many of you present and we look forward to this interesting evening. This lecture is part of an event series named Democracy, Bridging Facts and Norms, which we can organize thanks to the support of the University's graduate campus along the academic year 2015-2016. The main aim of this project is to open the discussion about the relationship between democratic ideals and democratic practices. This discussion takes place at two levels. On the one hand, democracy is studied from a number of academic approaches and disciplines that don't always communicate so much with each other. We thus organized two academic workshops with young researchers from various disciplines, one of which took place today in this university and will continue tomorrow, with the objective to offer them an opportunity to get feedback on their findings from different approaches, but also to discuss about how to bridge these different perspectives and to better collaborate. On the other hand, we want to contribute to the ongoing public debates on democracy, its demands, its limits, and its requirements within existing democracies. Tonight we'll hopefully offer such a contribution. We're extremely glad that Philippe Van Parijs accepted our invitation to come to Zurich to participate in our workshop and to talk tonight about justice and democracy. As the most famous defender of the unconditional basic income from the philosophical perspective, but also as the co-founder of the growing Basic Income Earth Network in 1986, we're certain that his insights and arguments can bring much to the Swiss political debates, especially since the Swiss citizens will vote on whether to introduce such a basic income on the 5th of June this year. We also would like to thank Reiner Eichenberger for accepting to join us tonight as a challenger to the idea of the unconditional basic income, as well as Philipp Löpfe for agreeing to moderate the event. And last but not least, we're extremely happy of our collaboration with Institut Zukunft, which is among the initiators of the Grundeinkommen-Initiative. Thank you for your help in organizing this event and for offering the apéro that will follow. I take the opportunity to already announce our next public event. The German philosopher Alex Demirovich will give a lecture on the tension between democracy and capitalism on June 9 here at the University of Zurich. We're already looking forward to seeing you there, but for now, hoping for a challenging and illuminating discussion, I will pass it on to our moderator for this evening. Philipp Löpfe is economic journalist at Watson and has for the second time received the prize of Economic Journalist of the Year. He is also the author of numerous books on economic and political issues, and I will let him present the speakers. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, but my job is actually only to moderate between Professor Van Parijs and Professor Eichenberger. But before I do that, I have to make a short introduction about Professor Van Parijs. He has studied political economy, philosophy, sociology, law, and linguistics. He has made his PhD at the University of Oxford. He was a professor at Harvard, so I think that speaks for itself. He's also probably the most renowned expert about the unconditional basic income. For decades he has studied the subject, so we can actually expect a very, very profound, short lecture. Professor Van Parijs, the floor is yours.
Vielen Dank und guten Abend. It happened to me in December 1982, I think. Suddenly I had an idea, a very simple idea. It had no name. I had to invent a name for it because I had never heard of it, never read about it. And as I was thinking about it in French, I gave it a French name, allocation universelle, universal benefit. I thought this simple ID was really what we needed in order to address major problem, which was involuntary unemployment on a massive scale, without relying on fast, indefinite growth. I thought this is what we need. But, you know, when you suddenly have an idea and you think, genial, so this is really what we need, then you have doubts. You think one of two things must be true. Either this idea has a fatal defect, which I have not yet spotted, or other people came to the same idea independently before me. The first thing did not happen. I've talked about that idea on 5 continents, in 7 languages, many objections, thousands of objections, and Reiner will formulate more this evening. But difficulties, yes, but no fatal objection. But the second thing happened. I discovered bit by bit that a number of other people had come to the same idea. Good company, 6 Nobel Prize winners in economics, and many other people. And now, recently, 130,000 Swiss people signed a request that triggered something that I hadn't been hoping for 33 years ago, namely that a whole people is going to be consulted about this idea. And in Switzerland, you know, these people who have an image of being conservative, of being rational, going for such a bold idea. Amazing. So it's a real privilege in this context to have this opportunity to talk to you, and in particular about the relationship between this idea of an unconditional basic income, justice, and democracy. First, it's always useful, even when you talk about a fairly familiar idea, definition. Because we say unconditional basic income, but it's not totally unconditional, and what is currently in place is already unconditional in some senses. What you have in Switzerland, what we have in most European countries, is something that is here called Sozialhilfe. Sozialhilfe is already unconditional in 3 important senses. One, it is paid in cash. It's not like food stamps or distribution of food as happens for the guaranteed minimum income in kind that may exist in some countries. It's given in cash. You can use it as you wish. 2, it is given not only to citizens, Swiss citizens, but also to other legal residents of the country. It's not subjected to a condition of nationality. Fine. And 3, most importantly, it's not an insurance system. It's not restricted to people who've contributed to an insurance system by paying social security contributions. So in this sense, Sozialhilfe is a guaranteed minimum income system, and also the French revenu minimum d'insertion, now revenu de solidarité active, and similar systems in many places in Europe and elsewhere. What is then the difference between a basic income, or so-called bedingungslose Grundeinkommen? What is the difference with Sozialhilfe? 3 more unconditionalities. 1, it's strictly individual. So whether you get it and how much you get is independent of your family situation, your housing situation, whether you cohabit or not. 2, it's also unconditional in the sense that there is no means test, no income test. You receive it whether you are poor or rich. Doesn't matter, at the same level. Okay, that's the second aspect, often called the universal aspect, this universal benefit in this sense. And third, unconditionality, there is also no work test or no willingness to work test. Right? It's given to people who choose to study, to look after their children, people who are involuntarily unemployed, who work part-time, and also those who are voluntarily unemployed in order to do other things, or even to do nothing, okay? These are the three unconditionalities that are specific to basic income. Still, it's not fully unconditional because it's not given to tourists, it's given to legal residents. Even among the legal residents, it won't be given to everyone. If one of you ends up in prison one day, well, you'll have a basic income in kind in the form of all the care you'll be given in the prison. But as soon as you won't have your basic income, which you could save while you are in prison, but as soon as you get out of it, you'll receive it. And also, that may matter in places like Geneva or in Brussels, it's not given to diplomats because they are not subjected to the local tax system. Okay, so it's not fully unconditional, but it's certainly unconditional in these three important senses. Now, why should it be introduced, and what difference would it make with respect to the present system? Let me ask you a question here. It's the only question I'll ask you tonight, so try to get it right. The question is the following. Do you think that a basic income, so defined, will lead to an increase in the wage level or to a decrease in the wage level? Wage level meaning, a bit more precisely, the average hourly remuneration of labor. So will the introduction of a basic income lead to an increase or a decrease of wages? So I'll ask, who among you thinks it will be one, and who among you thinks it will be the other? Reiner, you can't raise your hands because you are... No, no, you have to stay quiet at the moment, and you can't raise your hand because you are the expert on this, and I want people to have independent opinion on that. But by the way, your question was very good, so I'll return to that. No, shh, pretend you haven't heard him. Okay. Right, so who among you thinks that this will lead to an increase in the wage level? Those raise their hands. Okay. Who among you thinks that it will lead to a decrease in the wage level? Those raise their hands. Okay, that's 38% against 23% and a lot of abstentions to my dismay. So, okay. And the answer is, as Reiner rightly suggested, I'm going to have, I hope nevertheless, some disagreements later on. Yes, it depends crucially on the type of job that is. Because a basic income will at the same time make it easier to say yes to some jobs, even if they are badly paid, and it will enable you to say no to some jobs, some other jobs, which you are obliged to take now because of the lack of alternatives. You'll say yes to jobs, to internships, to jobs with a high training content, to jobs that are pleasant, to jobs that are risky also. You'll start as a self-employed person, you'll risk beginning with a startup, possibly with some colleagues. You'll risk having a life as an artist with uncertain incomes, providing you have, or given that you have this zockel, this firm floor on which to stand. But of course, if you now work with a terrible boss who mistreats you, insults you every day, with very unpleasant colleagues, and doing a shitty, unpleasant job that teaches you nothing, then you'll say, "Fort, I'm leaving, and I'm doing, not that I'm going to lie on a hummock for the rest of my life, no, but there are these other alternatives that are possible for me." And what will happen then? The employer who needs you, needs someone to do the job, will have the choice. Either he or she tries to improve the job, make it more attractive. If he doesn't want to do that or can't do that, then he may want to try to replace it by a machine so that the machine can do the job instead of you. And if neither of these options are used, well, then these jobs will need to be paid more. And if one day the basic income is sufficiently high, well, the people who are cleaning the toilets of this building may be paid more than Reiner or me, or even Reiner, who are certainly paid more than me. And Reiner and I'm sure would say this is only fair. Huh? This is only fair. These people are doing the shitty jobs, which we don't like to do. We like to do a job. I like to do my job. You like? No? More or less? No. Well, I like to do my job. And if I'm paid less than the people who clean our toilets, well, that's only fair, right? That's only fair. Right. So this, it's crucial for the argument in favor of basic income that we see this difference. And as Reiner rightly pointed out immediately, the crucial is the differential impact on these two types of jobs. But now comes, nevertheless, and here I turn to the connection with social justice. Now comes an objection that I had to face straight away when I started thinking about that. I thought it's a clever idea about it will solve a number of problems, and then people said, yes, but isn't it unjust to give an income to people who are able to work, but refuse to work, don't work? Isn't that unjust? Are these people not exploiting the hard workers? Okay? And you heard, all of you who talked about basic income must have heard some variant of this objection. What can be answered? Two things. The first thing, and each of these two replies comes again in many variants, and I'll be short just to give you the intuition behind it. The first thing is this. Let's assume, if only for the sake of the argument, that justice consists in rewarding people according to their labor, or more precisely, according to their useful contribution to society. Let's take that as the principle of justice. Well, think about this. Who would dare to say in this room there's someone who is well paid as a tax lawyer to advise rich taxpayers and corporations how best to evade taxation? This is a very well-paid job, I'm sure in Switzerland as in other places. Who would say that according to the principle of justice I just mentioned, this is fair? This is the market rewards these skills, these competencies in this way, and so this is what follows from justice. And who among you would say that, on the contrary, someone who gets up several times at night because the baby cries, who gets all the kids ready, having dressed, having breakfast before rushing to school, listening carefully to what the kids have to say after school, following their schoolwork, etc., and doing that all day long, and many other things, who would say that it's absolutely right from the point of view as justice, as reward of labor to each according to his or her labor, that these people should get nothing by way of income? Who would dare to say that? Who? No one. Okay, that's it. So what follows from that? Well, we could say, well, we need then a finer evaluation of each job, and we need to turn every parent who looks after children into a Staatsbeamte or a Lohnarbeiter, someone who would be paid a wage if they do their job well according to the number of hours. We don't want that, right? We don't want that. So we'll need a second best. And the second best consists in giving a modest income to everyone. Of course, there will be some people doing a bit less work than what would be deserving according to this criterion, but we'll have far less injustice, even in terms of to each according to his labor, his or her labor, if we distribute part of the income in an unconditional way to everyone. It's the second best, but it's far better than the present situation. But then there is a second answer, more fundamental, and that doesn't rely on this sort of second best argument, which is this. From time to time, it's good for people who are well paid, like Reiner, like me, and like a number of people, maybe like you too, and a bit less, so to reflect on which portion of our income is really due to our efforts, rather than to something else. Herbert Simon, one of the half a dozen of Nobel laureates who support basic income, formulated it in this way. He said, I should ask my fellow Americans what proportion of their income is really due to their labor. But I should compare how much they earn for a given job, say, for the sort of job I do, with what was earned by people 200 years ago, 100 years ago in US, or to what people earn doing the same sort of job in Calcutta or in Kinshasa, different circumstance, with the same level of efforts or even more. And he said, well, if I tell my fellow Americans that they deserve on these grounds 10% of their current income, I'll be generous to them. I'll be generous to them. So that will be. And what does that mean? It means that, in fact, people who have a high, stable income for a job they like doing, moreover, well, they have incorporated in their wage a huge gift, totally undeserved, something that was not due in any way to their efforts, but which they can grab in a very unequal way, an unfair way, because of where they were born, but also because of the talents they happen to, the marketable talents they happen to possess, because of the school they were sent to, because of the languages they were able to speak, and a number of things that are due to their circumstances rather than to their efforts. And so basic income, that's the fundamental justification for it. Basic income, that's not a redistribution of part of the fruits of the work of the hard workers to the people who choose to do nothing. Fundamentally, a basic income is a more fair, a more just distribution of these presents, these huge presents, undeserved by any of us, that we owe to technical progress, to capital accumulation, to all the know-how that is incorporated in our institutions. All this is through the working of our economy, including through all the things that have been done by the workers' movement in order to distribute it more widely among the population, but it's still distributed in a very unfair and unequal way. What the basic income does is provide to all this modest income so as to empower, of course, to give more power to say yes and to say no to jobs to the people who currently have least of that power, least of that real freedom. Now, this is justice. Let me now turn to democracy. Of course, and at the same time, more concretely, to what will be subjected to a vote very shortly in this country. When you do that, when we move from abstract discussions about what justice requires to more precise discussions about what a polity, what a legislature, in this case also the people, should choose, it's important to be a bit more specific. In particular, all the effects I've been describing are, of course, dependent on the level of the basic income. This level, as you know, most of you know, is specified in very broad terms in the proposal that will be put to the vote on the 5th of June. Article 2 says, thus, or point 2 in the article, this Article 110a of the Constitution says, das Grundeinkommen soll der ganzen Bevölkerung ein menschenwürdiges Dasein und die Teilnahme am öffentlichen Leben ermöglichen. And point 3 says, das Gesetz regelt insbesondere die Finanzierung und die Höhe des Grundeinkommens. Now, I'm just an insider, not only, I'm just an outsider, sorry, not only to, I'm an insider to the basic income movement, but an outsider to the initiative and an outsider to the Swiss Confederation. But allow me nonetheless the liberty to guess what would be the most likely interpretation which the legislature, point 3, which is going to have to adopt Gesetze in order to operationalize point 2, what the legislature and the two chambers of the Swiss parliament what is most likely that they would choose by way of interpretation of these formulations. I suspect that a number of people will remember that there is something in Switzerland called the Schweizerische Konferenz Sozialhilfe. And on their website, no doubt some people will have read, some of them may even have written it, something like the following sentence. Die Sozialhilfe hat gemäß Verfassung und Gesetzen ein menschenwürdiges Leben in bescheidenem Rahmen zu gewährleisten. Das soziale Existenzminimum gestattet die Teilhabe am gesellschaftlichen Geschehen. And I suspect people will say, between menschwürdiges Dasein in the proposal and menschwürdiges Leben in bescheidenem Rahmen on the website, there is not that much of a difference. And between Teilnahme am öffentlichen Leben and Teilhabe am gesellschaftlichen Geschehen, there is not that much of a difference. So I believe that unavoidably a reference point for the discussion will be the level that was considered by the Schweizerische Konferenz Sozialhilfe as the relevant one in order to achieve these objectives. What is this amount? Is it 2,500 Swiss francs, that is 38% of GDP per capita? No, the amount is 986 francs for a person living alone, plus a supplement that is less for each additional person. Now, it's of course important to see that this Sozialhilfe is meant to be supplemented, in particular by housing benefits, assistance for access for rent, access to housing, that is determined in various ways from one commune to another, from one canton to another. So my guess is that if a proposal like this one passes, this will be the natural point of reference. Of course, no one can pretend that this amount is sufficient. 986, 15% of GDP per capita, is sufficient to live on its own, to have this menschwürdiges Dasein, but it is supplemented by help that will vary according to circumstances for access to housing. So this could be introduced as a cash unconditional benefits, and then of course this additional help would remain means tested, subjected to the usual conditions. Can't we be more ambitious? Can't we be more ambitious? Of course, it's important for the people who rule our countries to be cautious, because they'll bear the responsibilities of the decisions they take, not me as a philosopher, let alone as a Belgian philosopher, right? So they'll have to take responsibility for the political consequences. Couldn't they be more ambitious? Couldn't they, for example, rely on the outcomes of some experiments that have happened and that are being planned now, especially in the Netherlands and in Finland, with amounts that are considerably lower than the 2,500 Swiss francs, but in terms of GDP per capita are closer to 25% of GDP per capita than 15%, which is what 986 Swiss francs is at the moment in Switzerland. Couldn't we be ambitious by learning from these experiments that are going to happen, if all goes well, from the January 2017 onwards? The answer is no. We won't be able to learn very much from it. Even in the best circumstances, that is, even if we assume that what happens in Finland and in Holland can be transposed to Switzerland, even if we assume that these experiments are done under the best methodological conditions, where you really have randomized experiments with a well-chosen control group so that you can really make causal assignments. So even in those circumstances, you won't be able to learn very much. Why not? Why not? There are three reasons. And it's very important also for when we have to frame the outcomes of these experiments and their relevance to our discussions in our respective countries. The first thing is that any such experiment is necessarily of short duration. You tell people for 2 years, for 3 years, you receive this basic income, okay? And then people will react to that. Some people will say, well, this is a unique opportunity, I'll do something else for these 2 years. Other people will say, well, it's only for 2 years, I won't give up my job. So there is no way of guessing what the impact would be if people had this basic income for the rest of their lives and knew it. First difficulty, time limitation. Second difficulty, more serious. As I mentioned before, what's key in the argument for basic income, including for the economic argument in favor of basic income, its impact on the labor market. The fact that as a result of this redistribution of the possibility, the real freedom to say yes and to say no, you'll have more jobs being created that provide a lot of training, and more internships will be made possible by such a reform on the one hand, and on the other hand, a number of jobs that are unattractive will need to be paid more. Are we going to observe that in the experiments? Of course not, because you give this basic income to 150 people or 1,000 people in the labor market of 500,000 or 5 million people. But the impact and the demand response to this supply effect will not exist and therefore not be observable. That's the second fundamental limit. And the third one is that equally intrinsic is that you can have these experiments, as you had also in Canada and United States in the 1970s, with the people whose fate, whose material situation is improved as a result of the introduction of the scheme. But if there is a net cost, as there will always be, if only tiny, there will always be a net cost. Well, you can't tell people, look, we are going to have a nice experiment for 2 or 3 years and you'll be taxed more than anyone else in society with the same income as you. Whether you can't force people to enter such experiments, and if you ask for volunteers, I'm afraid you won't have many, or the sample you'll get will be a few saints, and therefore it will be a very biased sample from which you will be able to draw nothing. So that even with the best results from these experiments, people who are opposed to the scheme will always be able to say, and rightly so, look, this cannot be approved that the scheme is sustainable because you didn't check at all the funding side, the effect of the funding side, the fact that effective marginal rates of taxation on some workers will be higher than otherwise. So what are given these limits, is there no way of getting confidence in moving forward in a significant way? Yes, we'll have to do with the third model of social protection exactly the same thing as was done with the 2 previous models of social protection. The 2 existing models of protection are social assistance and social insurance. Social assistance originated, public assistance originated at the beginning of the 16th century. Some municipalities that started saying it's the job of the municipality and not of private charity to look after the poor. Social insurance started at the end of the 19th century under Bismarck, 1883, with the first state-organized pension systems and invalidity and sickness insurance. What did I do when they started? Did I do randomized experiment? Did Bismarck say we are going to pick a few cities and then see control group and all the rest before we know? No. Did the municipality of Ypres in Flanders before starting did that? No, they didn't do. They started modestly. The level of public assistance in Ypres or in Bruges in the beginning of the 16th century was peanuts compared to the Swiss Sozialhilfe today. Bismarck's pension system was a remarkable utopia, far more utopian than basic income is today. But it was very modest compared to the pension system that is currently in place in Switzerland. We'll have to do the same with basic income. We'll have to start modestly with an income that is rather the amount I mentioned, 983 Swiss francs, rather than something far more ambitious. And funded, and so often in the Swiss debate, funding by VAT is being proposed. I'm not a principled opponent of VAT. I think we can increase the part of VAT in public funding, but I don't think at all that the introduction of a basic income should be linked to a massive increase in VAT. The best way to introduce it softly in Switzerland, like in other countries, like in Germany or in France, consists in funding it with personal income taxation. Of course, most of a modest basic income can be, in some sense, self-financed through a reduction of all the existing benefits by the amount of the basic income if they are higher than that, and then you keep a top-up that remains conditional, and also through a reform of personal income taxation. There is no more any reason to give an exoneration, a zero rate of tax on the lower part, on the lower brackets of the income tax, and so that's the sort of computations you need to make. With it, and that's my conclusion then, also that connects in a way democracy and justice. Can we convince, will it be possible for the initiators of the proposal to convince the Swiss population that it's the interest of every Swiss citizen to introduce such a basic income? No way, no way. But I believe it is possible to get people behind the idea coming from very different parts of the political spectrum. I was interviewed yesterday by Le Temps, and the interview was published this morning, and I immediately got some reactions, including a reaction from someone in Geneva who had just finished reading a book by Ayn Rand. Some of you may know Ayn Rand is an ultra-liberal American writer who died a number of years ago, and compared to her, Milton Friedman is a real softie, right? And so he just finished reading that, and then he reads this interview. And then he quotes from this book by Ayn Rand, he quotes the following. He says, Ayn Rand, or some figure in the book, says, there is nothing more dangerous than a communist masquerading as an intellectual, he quotes. Nevertheless, he said, I like the debate, and I must say this idea of universal basic income I find very tempting. And next time you come to Geneva, I'll invite you for dinner, okay? So I replied to him that I'll bear it in mind, And that, of course, there was no surprise that people who are attracted to the idea of freedom should have sympathy for a universal basic income. In fact, anyone who is serious about freedom should be in favor of a basic income, providing it's not just formal freedom, it's real freedom, and real freedom for all, not just for the rich. So he answered, maybe. So I'll see when I meet him. But then, so that, but beyond that, there's really something very important that you can be, in fact, at first sight on the right of the spectrum because you are very anti-state, you hate state bureaucracy, and you believe in freedom, but you are serious about it, and just not a pretext to defend the interests of the rich. Well, you can be attracted to the idea. But then similarly, on the left, I was invited recently to Bahrain to a meeting organized by the left, the far left fraction of the European Parliament. So Syriza, Podemos, Rifondazione, etc. And people invited me there specifically to talk about basic income because a number of them, not all of them, believed that it was not the right sort of tack to take when you say, we on the left who are in favor of equality against freedom. No! People on the left should not say we are for equality and against freedom. People on the left should be in favor of freedom, but of course, freedom again, freedom for all, real freedom. Equality, you must ask, equality of what? What we want to equalize is freedom, and that's what basic income is there for. Of course, it's not a panacea, it's not the only thing we need. We need continued education throughout life, an efficient healthcare system, public spaces, many other things are needed, but basic income is central. So it won't be possible to convince every Swiss citizen, maybe Reiner, but not everyone, that it's in our personal interest, in their personal interest to go for a basic income. But I think it is possible to convince all those who are committed to the conception of justice that makes room for personal responsibility, that makes room for economic efficiency, but at the same time places freedom for all at its very core. Thank you.
Okay, wir wechseln die Sprache und wechseln auf Deutsch. Der Grund dafür liegt darin, dass die beiden Professoren sich darauf geeinigt haben, dass Herr Professor Reiner Eichenberger Deutsch spricht. Herr Professor Van Parijs wird weiterhin Englisch antworten. Falls das ein Problem geben sollte, werden wir wieder auf Englisch switchen. Aber wir haben uns auch darum geeinigt, dass es unsinnig wäre, wenn ich da noch übersetzen würde. Das gäbe viel zu viel Verzögerung.
Now, would you like me to talk in English, or has anybody preference for German? No. You like not to understand it, of course. Okay.
Okay, we stay in it.
It's no problem. So
okay, we'll stay with English then. Well, before I give the word to Professor Reiner Eichenberger, I would like to introduce him shortly. He's one of the leading Swiss economists. He's also one of the most controversial Swiss economists because he usually speaks very clearly what he thinks, and sometimes it's not what everybody else thinks. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion, I'm quite sure. Professor Eichenberger, by the way, teaches at the University of Fribourg. Now, Professor Eichenberger, you've got a very difficult job now. We just heard that Professor Van Parijs has actually analyzed the question of the UBI for decades, and he has never found a fatal error so far. Now, your job tonight is to find that fatal error. But we could also say he was only talking about democracy and fairness. He wasn't talking about economics. So perhaps you have an answer there. Perhaps you see the weakest link is maybe economy. Is that correct?
No, so of course it's a very nice idea. So all these conditional systems we have today, of course, have huge problems involved. So the incentives to work for people who are now in the Sozialhilfe, of course, are very low, because when you earn your own money, of course, you have to give 100% of it to the government. The second is the labor market is totally regulated in order to increase the income of poor workers or not so well-qualified workers. And we have huge regulations in the market for housing markets. And of course, if one thinks that if we introduce such a thing like unconditional basic income, we could get rid of all these, not stupid, crazy regulations, but all these regulations. And then we would have freedom here. Then, of course, it's a very nice idea. But there is one question is, would we really get rid of all these regulations? I doubt that we would get rid of these regulations. And the second point is, can we finance it? So can we pay for the system? And is Switzerland the right place to introduce such a system? When you think about what is, as I said, what is the advantages to get rid of all these crazy regulations? So this means it's the better to introduce this new system, the worse today's system is. So the worse Sozialhilfe is, the worse labor markets are regulated, the worse housing markets are regulated, and the more more closer a society, so the less immigration you have, the easier it is to introduce such a system. The problem now is that Switzerland is exactly the country with one of the best functioning labor markets. It's crazy regulated, but it's less crazy regulated than where you are coming from, Belgium or in France and so on. We have a better working social system, so it's much better working than the French one, the Belgian one. And we have a very open society. We have much more immigration than Belgium. So therefore, Switzerland is really not the place we should introduce it, because the benefits are much lower compared to the cost than in other countries. The second point is just how to finance it. Of course, you were perfectly right. It depends.
Can you split it up? Can you just say whether is Switzerland the right place to introduce the basic income? What do you say, Mr. Van Parijs? We know there were successful experiments in India, there were successful experiments in Namibia. Switzerland is a highly developed country. Is it possible? Is it not the wrong country, so to speak, as Professor Eichenberger claims?
Well, it's certainly the wrong country, but as Belgium or France would be, to introduce what was done in Namibia or in India, because we have it. And we have far more than that, because there was one village in Namibia in which a real basic income was introduced for 1,000 people. And there were all sorts of beneficial effects, no doubt about that. But the background was a situation in which there was no benefit whatever. Mm-hmm. And so most of the effects you could observe were just the effects of introducing more purchasing power in that area. So more people were at work because there was more demand around it. So similar in India, you started from a situation in which there was practically nothing. So that it's far more, what was experimented with there was far more something like the introduction of Sozialhilfe at a low level. Even in Namibia, it was only 3% of GDP per capita in Namibia. So any sort of extravagant conclusions that are drawn from the beneficial effects of a basic income in those places is really out of place when we think about Switzerland. But I don't think that was what Reiner had in mind. It was more the comparison. And so he said, well, the labor market in Switzerland is not working too badly compared, because it's less regulated than elsewhere, so perhaps we don't need it as much as elsewhere. But there I would like to quote you one figure which I think is important to think about, again from my source, which is trustworthy, I think, Schweizerische Konferenz Sozialhilfe. They're serious people, right? Okay. Yes. Well, what they're saying...
No, they are not everybody agrees, huh?
Not everybody, okay. Well, whether you agree on they're serious people or not...
Seriously wrong, yeah.
Well, you may agree with the following statement. If I can speak a little bit of German, is that okay? So, aufgrund der Armutsquote von über 7,5% ist zu vermuten, dass viele armutsbetroffene Menschen in der Schweiz ihren Anspruch auf Sozialhilfe aus verschiedenen Gründen nicht geltend machen.
Exactly.
And so that means, in fact, Sozialhilfe covers about 3% of the Swiss population, but there is a very significant part of the Swiss population that remains under this threshold, for reasons well exposed, for example, by Tony Atkinson in his recent books, which is that universal systems are systematically far better in reaching the poor. And there are lots of international studies establishing that for two reasons. One is that you need to have a lot of information and be sort of now increasingly computer literate in order to know what to do in order to get access to these benefits, one. And two, there is the stigmatization. Atkinson said increased by the sort of bad image which the media give to being just a destitute and so on. And for these reasons, there is a growing number of people who don't take advantage of rights they have. In France, the guaranteed minimum income, there are only 50% of the people entitled to it who actually get access to it.
But that's an important point. So the take-up rate in Switzerland is, according to the different estimates, between 30 and 50%. And now one can have two different perspectives on that. One can say, oh, that's too bad. We should need 100% take-up rate. So everybody who hasn't really, who is poor according to the standards of this commission's course, they should get Sozialhilfe. And if they do not take it up themselves, so we force them to take the money. And the other position is, oh, great, those people who do not take up those 50% do not take up it, they do not need it. They are quite happy being they're self-reliant, so they are independent, they feel freedom. And so why should we force them to take it up? And so depending upon the system, when you have a system like in Germany where the take-up rate is much higher than in Switzerland, then of course if you substitute such a system with a high take-up rate, with an enforcing system, with enforced Sozialhilfe, then of course you have not much additional cost. But in Switzerland with this low take-up rate, of course you have a strong increase in de facto take-up rate, so in de facto cost. That's one additional argument why from my position it's not good to introduce it in Switzerland. But of course, if you say this low take-up rate, it's bad, and these people feel forced, they are afraid to take up the money, then of course, your proposition is more beneficial.
The UBI as something that the state forces upon the people, does that make sense to you? How do you...
Well, there is already an old discussion about that. In fact, Jim Tobin was one of the first big economists to defend basic income, and he discusses, he's the first one who published technical papers about the ID in 1967. And already in this paper, he discusses the question of whether it's better to have a real basic income given ex ante to everyone, or rather to have a sort of negative income tax where you first check what is the income of the people and then you give them an additional income in such a way as to preserve incentives. And he said to choose between the two, there is no doubt that you must choose for what he called then a demogram, because the number of people, the people who most need it, are also the people who are worst equipped in order to find out exactly how to get there. Mm-hmm. This being said, I'm not totally unreceptive to your arguments. I also think that a number of people who don't take advantage of the benefits are in situations in which, if only because they share housing with other people, in fact they need it less than some other people. But I wouldn't say that that what we try to do when reducing the rate of take-up of these things is trying to force the food and the thing into people's mouth when in fact they don't need it. So obviously for many people it's really...
I would like to come back a little bit to the literature. So you always say, okay, there was all these ideas in the 60s, in the 70s by Friedman, so this was more or less basic income. Of course, the discussion in economics was basic income or negative income tax, and of course depending upon the definition, you could say, oh, it's basic income or negative income tax, but it's in some way equivalent. So you get something if you do not work, and if you work, you are highly taxed. So in order to finance the basic income of those who do not work, or even of those who work. So that's the system. But this literature or this idea is just dead in economics. There are, of course, some experiments now in developing countries, but when one looks at them, I would not transfer them. The circumstances which were there in these developing countries, I would not say, oh, these are experiments which you really should transfer the idea to Switzerland or to Europe. But just when you look at the literature, negative income tax, it's really, we just laugh if there are always these liberals from the Freisinnige FDP who say, oh, we have a great idea, we should introduce negative income tax. But of course they are against basic income at the same time, because they do not know that it's the same. But we just laugh at it. This is for ideas from the 60s. It's clear that they do not work. Either the payments are too low in order to really free people, or they are too high in order to be financed. You said these payments in Switzerland are not so high, but I can assure you, usually people get about 2,500 francs, so if you are independent. And the problem is you cannot, so if there are a pair of two live together, they perhaps get 4,000 or 4,500, so they get a little bit less than twice the 2,500 in the average. But you cannot say, oh, depending, they get the payments, not really the double of the payments for one person if they live together, because then it's conditional upon their living situation. And you cannot introduce basic income to everybody and then just make it dependent upon the situation of living, whether they live together with somebody in an apartment or whether they live alone. So you have just to pay them what today is paid, and this is about 2,500 francs in Switzerland. Okay. We can also reduce it to 2,000. But then when you add it up, it's just impossible to finance it. I can make the calculations. But now you see a discussion in Germany where there is very interesting, perhaps you know some of them are economists, and Neue Ökonomenstimme. So it's a main forum for exchange of ideas of economists. There is now the discussion from Swiss economists who say it's absolutely impossible to finance it, Kirchgessner. And there is a German group who they say, oh, no, the stupid Swiss, of course one can finance it. It only needs a tax rate for everybody who works, so a flat tax of 68.9%. Huh? It's quite nice. They are in favor of basic income, but the problem is it's a basic income of 800 euros, fixed 800 euros. We are talking about 2,500 francs. And of course you can say, okay, the Germans are not so rich than the Swiss because they have more stupid regulations. You can adjust it, but then the difference is about 40% if you make all the calculations. So these 800 euros are equivalent for Swiss circumstances to about 17 or 1,800 Swiss francs. And then, of course, you see, oh, the Swiss proposal, 2,500, is 30 to 40% higher. And if you add to this tax rate of 70%, another 40%, you are there where Kirchgessner is, it needs a tax rate of more than 100% to finance it.
Okay, let's not get too technical about this.
Yeah, that's important. Tax rates about 100% are nice.
We've got the message, we can't pay for it. But now let's let's go back from the 60s to the 21st century, and let's talk about digitalization. I mean, we read daily now that how many thousands, 10,000, 100,000 jobs are going to vanish because people are replaced by software, by robots, by whatsoever.
This toilet cleaner does not exist anymore. He says, oh, the wage for toilet cleaning will increase. Okay. That's a good time, good times. So, there will be no toilet cleaning anymore.
Okay.
Because at his university, they develop robots in order to clean the toilets.
Okay. But when we have those robots and when you have those smart softwares and all those things, isn't there simply a necessity to have something like a basic income, because otherwise people who have no jobs have no money? What do you say as a non-economist?
Yeah, so that enables me also to return to and to correct you on what you said in connection with negative tax experiments. You said the idea of a negative income tax is dead. I'm reading all the economics journals and no one talks about it. This is not where you should try to detect what matters. And
that's true. That's a good point.
And what is relevant to address the current problems, indeed, if you look at the US today, I'm in the process of reading a book that's going to be, the draft of a book that's going to be published just after the Swiss referendum by one of the main American trade unionists. It's called Raising the Floor, and the subtitle is a defense, it's a defense of a universal basic income as a way of reviving the American dream. This is someone who was the head of a trade union with 2.5 million workers in it. At the same time, in the Silicon Valley, you have a number of people. Someone has just launched one of the big shots in Silicon Valley, is recruiting people in order to try to design a pilot study about basic income, driven by the sort of arguments you mentioned. Is that leading to a sort of revival of something that was experimented and then abandoned in the 1970s? I had a discussion about that with James Tobin at the time when I was visiting professor at Yale. I had a long discussion about that. And he said, and that really stuck with me, said he was one of those who inspired these experiments. And he said these experiments had two main outcomes that were significant, that were what were shown, where there was a causal relationship undeniably. And he said, I was not surprised by the results, but I was surprised and disappointed by the political reaction to it. What were these two main results? Bearing in mind, I must introduce immediately disqualifications, that the negative income tax experiments that were introduced then were not a basic income, not only because they were not paid ex ante, but you needed to check what people's incomes were in order to know what to give them. And secondly, they were not individual, they were household-based. Moreover, for many people who received them, were not entitled to anything before. So it's quite different from the situation in which you have Sozialhilfe. So with these qualifications, you had two effects of these experiments. The first one is that there was a modest but statistically clearly significant negative impact on the labor market participation of secondary earners, mostly mothers. And two, there was an increase in some of the experiments, not all, there was a clear increase, modest, but again statistically significant, in the divorce rate. Okay? Now, how should this be interpreted? Well, very simply, some women who were forced to have a double shift, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning in order to go and get their kids somewhere, then rushed by bus to a remote job in order to do that, these people say, I have some time to relax, I'll work a bit less. Now, possibly this would not be a long-term effect also for the reasons I mentioned before, because the jobs, the employers who needed these women may have to pay more for these women if it had been introduced on the whole of the labor market. One, and two, some of these women were really pissed off with their partner or whatever, and finally here was a chance to leave him behind. And so Tobin said, well, this is good, right? This is good. And nevertheless, this was regarded, and in the American discussion, we were then reaching the Reagan years, etc. Oh, this is terrible, this will reduce labor market participation and so on. So that was what led then to abandonment, and it's clear that after a lot of interest, in fact, by the time these negative income experiments were finished, no one was interested in them. The one in Canada, in fact, the results were not studied until 15 years later because everyone had lost interest in them at the time. But now there is, for the reason you mentioned, there is really a renewed interest. Why is there this renewed interest from California to Korea? For two reasons. One is that there is this, what's sometimes described as a third wave automation. Now, the arguments for basic income in the 1930s or in the 1960s were also partly driven by that. But now we are in a situation in which we don't think that this increase in the productivity of labor will be matched by growth in order to sort of give jobs to the people who were made redundant as a result of technical innovation, technical progress. That's one. And the other reason is that the sort of jobs, due to computerization, a number of other things, you have an increasing proportion of precarious jobs. In many countries, a growth of self-employment relative to a shrinking of the size of the firms. And all this make jobs, part-time work far more important, intermittent work far more important. And so the people argue, so the Silicon Valley people argue, or these trade unions argue, well, if we look ahead, we don't just try to defend what exists, as many trade unions do, but let's look ahead. What we need today is really not just a patching up of the two existing models, public assistance and social insurance. We need something that will enable these other models to work better than they do now, and not
You have a funny view of labor unions. You think they are future-oriented, they have a huge perspective, they fight for freedom and not for regulation and protecting their rents. But I think they are just protecting their rents. So I think that there's different basic assumptions. The second point is just coming back. So, no, the first, of course, is do robots take our work away? No, unfortunately, they will not. But if they do, so if they produce everything cheaper than men are doing it, no problem. Then all the products get very cheap. Huh? Everything will be cheap. Then we can decrease the basic income very much, of course. And you can, the labor markets, as long as they are flexible, so if you look at the technical development since human mankind is existing, is huge. And we have no unemployment in not so highly regulated labor markets. So we have more or less a full employment system in Switzerland, and we have had it now for centuries. So therefore, I am not afraid, and I think, so it's, of course, it's a different discussion, we should not lead it today, but there are very good arguments. Unfortunately, labor will not go out, we will also work in the future. But the important thing is, what do you think about the 70% tax rate for everybody who works? So this is a flat tax. These Germans, they were absolutely in favor of basic income, and their result is 70% tax rate. For me, 70% tax rate for everybody. So for the first franc you earn yourself, that's not freedom. You cannot say, oh, we have a system which gives freedom to everybody. Everybody gets a basic income, and this creates freedom. No, it creates unfreedom, the opposite of freedom. Huh? We will be slaves. We have to work in order to pay taxes. 70% is no freedom.
If you don't work, you don't pay taxes.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
What are you
That will, if I work in the shadow economy, if I get, perhaps the income in different kind, so in kind and not in money, it will not be taxed. There will be huge innovation how to pay people, not with money, but with other benefits, so that they are not taxed. I would not like to live in such a system, because then government has to control everything. What is your income? Is it money, or is it just income in kind? And this will not be freedom, this will be invasion by the government in everything we are doing.
Okay, we should now open the discussion to questions from you. There's some people running around with microphones, so who has a question to whom? Eno? Yeah.
So, Philipp, thank you very much. Give me your suggestion about the vote in Switzerland. Some regards or something, what you say, what should be, and what you wish, what it will be.
I didn't quite get what I would like the result of the vote to be.
If you are in the rule to say what we have to do, or what you wish what will come from this for the world, for democracy in the world, because we have no longer democracy, for example, in the US and not in the EU. And this is a topic of your speech today. And I guess it's interesting to hear from you, your point of view, what is the meaning of this public vote? And what is it for you? And what is the thing what you will to give us in Switzerland to do that as your proposal or your profound idea?
That's a very demanding question. But first of all, and in a way, I mean, it's really for you to answer that than for me. And I must say I have great admiration and respect for the initiators of this whole movement, in fact, around it. As you realize, this is something that has an impact far beyond Switzerland. And in fact, part of the interest all the way to the United States comes from the fact that this strange fact that even the Swiss are talking about this idea, whatever they're going to vote, and that's one of the marvels of this pretty unique institution which you have, which are these popular initiatives that can feed public debates, sometimes on the wrong issues, sometimes on the right issues, in this way. And so therefore you have a debate that's far wider, far more people are involved in it, and I think that's a great thing. I also think that direct democracy must never be sort of the exclusive way of deciding in a country, and that representative democracy has an important role to play. Now, with regard to the campaign, I would say it's important to listen to people like Reiner, to listen respectfully, carefully to what he says. And some of the things he says you should not believe, but some of the things he said are really very important points in this discussion. In particular, I think he's absolutely right that if you have an individual basic income at the level of 2,500 Swiss francs, then the effective rate of taxation, marginal rate of taxation on the bulk of the workers will be unsustainable. And so but there is a way of addressing that question, which is by contenting yourself with a lower level and with top-ups that remain conditional. And that amounts, in fact, to keeping what is de facto for some of the beneficiaries, something like a 100 effective rate of taxation. That is, if you say you only receive this aid for the rent, you only receive it if you don't have an income from another source and so on, it amounts to taxing them at a very high rate. But that makes it possible, of course, to keep the marginal rates of taxation on other parts of the working population far lower. Now, I think this is fairly technical and too technical to discuss in detail in this room, but I think it's important to keep your idea, to say this is a Kulturimpulse. It's important, it's a Kulturimpulse, it's something, but in order to convince the bulk of the Swiss population, you need more than that, and you need to enter a number of technical issues like those that were legitimately raised by Reiner. This is a very partial answer to your question, but there are more questions around, so...
First, no, you said we should listen to Professor Eichenberger. I think he has an alternative plan, so let's hear it.
I don't know whether I should bring it now, but I think this discussion in Switzerland can show one thing which is important, where we all agree. We have a problem with today's system, so it reduces freedom, all these regulations we have. And basic income is in some way, a fascinating idea. It's something like Befreiungstheologie. And I think there is... When we think about it, how can we find a system which is better than basic income? I think you should think about what is a good father or a mother doing for her kids. Is she paying for her a lifelong basic rent or basic income? No good parents will do this because they know this will destroy their kids. If they just get for the whole life basic income from the rich parents, this will be bad for the kids. those rich parents will say, okay, we will provide the kids with a basic capital when they become 20. And they can spend the money in some way as they will, but we will regulate it a little bit. They cannot spend it at the first day for a Ferrari or such thing, but over the time, if they have difficult times, they can take from the money. Perhaps if they make the tertiary education when you go to university, they can pay part of it with this fortune. And I think that's the best way. So we should have unconditional basic capital. And of course, in the United States, so I invented, it's exactly the same story as you told. I invented this. Everybody said, it's a great idea. You should publish about this and do research. Then I told it to Bruno Frey, and he said, oh, well, that's just the idea of Bruce Ackerman, and it was a great discussion in the United States. Nobody in Switzerland at times of 2008 knew anything about this huge discussion in the United States about 2000, about the stakeholder society idea. This is exactly the idea. So everybody who becomes 20 gets about, there was $80,000, and then he can pay for this, whatever he likes in difficult circumstances and so on. And this really gives freedom to people. And this doesn't make them dependent from their salary, which gets in every year or every month. But they have to become self-sufficient. They have to become independent and free. I think this is, could easily finance it. Huh? This is 8 billion per year. It's about the cost in Switzerland would be 8 billion per year. Basic income is about 200 billions. And it's better from my point of view, it's from a philosophical point of view, it's better from, at least from my, not philosophical point of view, but from the economic point of view, it's much better, and therefore I would just opt for a basic, unconditional basic capital.
It's even worse than what you said, because the idea is much older.
It's much, of course.
Thomas Paine proposed it.
And I think even among the Romans, there was this idea.
Not really, but the first, Thomas Paine, 1796, proposed a basic endowment for every child reaching the age of 21, exactly. And a basic pension for every elderly person. That meant from the age 50 exactly. At the time. Yeah.
Well, actually, it's true. Even the Romans had Panetic Brotenspiele, which is also a kind of basic income. I think broad was actually for free in old Rome. But anyway, next question over there.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. What I'm missing here, and what is important to myself, is the point of being lucky and happy in life. And I had times where I made tons of money. I had times in my life where I made pretty much no money. Both were challenging in their own way. And I studied flow very much because my mission is also to bring flow to companies. And flow is all about liking the job, liking what I do, feeling sense in my life. And what I see as the biggest chance in the whole thing, off track of the money, is that people can much more be encouraged to do what they really like, what really makes sense to them, what they really feel is worth living. That's my main point and biggest chance that I see in the whole discussion here.
Professor Van Parijs? Is a basic income a way to lead to a more fulfilling life?
Well, it's many of us are lucky enough to be able to lead a fulfilling life because of the privileges that happen to be given. And so what basic income would mean is not to give everyone the possibility to do exactly the sort of life he or she would like to live. If there are some people who would like to have a very high income in order to paint ugly portraits for the rest of their lives, which no one wants to buy, and they are only willing to do that if they get 2,500 Swiss francs paid by other people to them, then we can say, well, sorry, this is not going to happen. But of course, even with a modest basic income, you give far more possibility to people to choose the sort of activity which they like to do, and because they like to do it, they'll do it well. As many of you know, one of the biggest advocates of basic income in Germany is Götz Werner, who's been flamboyantly defending pretty high basic income. He's the boss of a firm with 26,000 employees, drugstore chain, and he says, I want a basic income because my workers will work better than is currently the case, because they'll work, the people who will work for the firm will do so freely. And so it's really a way, I mean, sort of pretty rough way of saying, vindicating the way in which a basic income will contribute to the dynamism of the economy is really that you'll enable more people to do the sort of work they do by acquiring in time the sort of training they need so that they can sort of change direction when they are 40, before they are too old, and in the end work longer in their lives than is currently the case, because they avoided the burnout, because they avoided having skills that are obsolete. But the key idea is really closely related to what you said. You need to make it possible for more people to do what they like in their lives. They'll innovate more, they'll be more creative, and therefore, in the end, even if that's not always the case for everyone, nor always in the immediate sense, in the end, that will be also better, not only for our society, but for our economy.
Of course, it's difficult at first sight to disagree with you, but I would totally disagree. So it's not important that people do whatever they like to do, but it's important that people do what they like to do under the constraint that there are other people in the world. So they should not create externalities, and they should take into account that what they are doing creates value or disvalue for the others. And that's exactly what the market economy is for.
Like the tax lawyer I mentioned before?
When they do what they like, they pay a price. When they produce these ugly paintings, they cannot sell it. When they clean the toilet and other people think it's important that the toilet is cleaned, they get salary for it. And so that's the great thing in a market economy. People are not just doing whatever they like, independent of what all others want, but it's an optimal mixture of what those people like we are looking at and what the others like. And therefore, economists think markets are something really great if they work. And we have to search for the conditions under which they work.
But the basic income is not against markets, no, just to say.
No.
I mean, Werner Götz just mentioned he's one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Germany.
But I think, again, when we introduce basic income, if we really abolish all these crazy regulations now on the labor market, perhaps it would be better. And for example, this German calculations for the 70% tax rates, this was not included, so that perhaps labor markets are becoming more efficient because we can drop the regulations. But that's the important question. Do we really drop these regulations afterwards? Or don't we? Perhaps we do even increase the regulations. And this discussion has not been led so far.
Okay, but that's a very different discussion. Perhaps we should go to the next question. Up there.
So I have a question about the transition process. It seems that the good things about basic income would come with it being substantial enough, because it has to actually give us, volume is not usually a problem that I have, but your face seems to indicate that it is this time. Can you hear me well?
Can you put your microphone perhaps a bit further away from your mouth?
Yes, okay, good. So it seems that basic income needs to be substantial enough, even if modest, in order to provide the sufficient decommodification that will bring out the good things about it, namely the real freedom to say no. If that is the case, I have some doubts about us being able to learn something from the minimal transitional story of the two other models of social protection, right? So in the very same way in which the temporary experiments don't teach us much about basic income, it seems to me that starting with something that is minimal and that is not really enough to decommodify us might not really teach us how people would behave with the kind of basic income that we actually want, namely one that will actually give people the real freedom to say no. Unless I'm missing something.
But no, what might be missing is that the freedom and the power to say no is a matter of degree. That is, even if you, and the fact that if you give up your job, thereby showing that you are voluntarily unemployed, you don't fall on nothing at all, but you fall on these 800 Swiss francs or 500 euros in some, and you may be living with someone who has another income and so on. And that will enable you to wait longer, to work part-time when before only full-time was possible. And so you don't need, and that's very important for the debate, you don't need to have something that you regard as something you could live on, just, especially on your own, especially in a city for the rest of your life, to have the freedom to say no. The freedom to say no, like the freedom to say yes to some jobs. And many people have to accept an internship now that is completely unpaid. And they nevertheless accept it because of the prospect it offers. But they can borrow, they have some help from their parents, conceivably. And so this is a possibility which you generalize, which is now the privilege of the few whose parents can indeed give them a basic income for the initial stage, but it would be generalized. So there are many things that people do, and indeed the 7.5% of the Swiss population under the threshold, they don't even have this amount. And so it's really important, I think, that we shouldn't say it's all or nothing. There is then, at some point, there is the possibility to say no when it's sufficient to live on. No, the fact that it's, even with a lower income, you can go and work with your sister and run a little shop for a while, and there are all sorts of possibilities which are, and so it's the fact that you can say yes to some jobs is at the same time affects your possibility to say no to the other jobs, because it gives further possibility. But I agree with you that it's a matter of degree.
No, but couldn't we go a little bit further? So if it's not just stupid redistribution, so the basic income, if it's not just to take from the rich and to give to the poor, but if it's really an efficient system which makes people feeling free, then we can introduce it just by saying, okay, we have now two types of citizens. We have citizens who are in the current system, and we have citizens who can go to the new system. And then some people will say, okay, we are going to the new system, so when we are working, we are paying more taxes, because paying taxes is no problem, it's for freedom, and they will pay, and the other will take the money, and everybody will be happy, and the others who want to be in the old system can stay in the old system. The problem could be that it turns out that nobody who pays is going into this new system. Because it's just a redistribution system. But if you really believe it makes people feeling free, also those who pay, not only those who consume at the cost of the others, then it's no problem to introduce it just as we have a dual model. We have two types of citizens.
Okay, one last question. The gentleman here in the middle.
Thank you very much. I think during the talk we talk a lot about, we compared the system to the system of social health. Social health. But I don't think that this basic and conditional revenue should be compared to that, because I think the basic idea of this one is not to provide more money to the people who are in the need, but is for a better distribution of the total wealth of a country, because the system implemented within a country. And my question would be, do you think that this system could push up the lower wages and push down the higher wages, and to have a better redistribution of the wealth, and to lower the gap that is currently really big between the poor and the rich in Switzerland? Thank you.
Can it be done? What do you think, Professor?
Yes. So, as I mentioned before, the effect on wages will be very different depending on the sort of activity we are talking about. Then the question of whether it will reduce the level of inequality in the country will depend, I think, less on the introduction of the basic income than on the structure of our tax system, and particularly the way in which it deals with the transnational mobility of the higher incomes, including the incomes from capital, capital gains, and so on. So overall inequality will depend on the extent to which you tax capital income and not just what happens to the labor market. And that may indeed be one of the arguments for turning more than is the case now to VAT relative to the personal income tax, which tends to affect labor income far more than capital income, whereas there are various reasons at least two arguments that indicate that VAT would be a better tool, but international coordination is at least as important, because the reason why some of us professors, and especially the less professors of philosophy but more professors of economics get paid as much as they are paid, or even more high-tech experts, etc., is not that they wouldn't do the job if they would pay less, but that they have opportunities abroad that would pay them more because of lower taxation. And so international coordination is absolutely essential, and for the taxation of capital, like for the taxation of human capital, of high wages. So we need the collaboration within the EU and with Switzerland, because we sometimes have a problem with Switzerland in this respect.
That's so nice, huh? We start with a system which should give us freedom, and we end up with international regulations, not with the Swiss government regulating the international audience, but with an anonymous international monopoly government which regulates the whole world, huh? And taxation. So we end up in absolutely unfreedom. So therefore, believe me, it's not the basic income, but it's basic unconditional capital. We can introduce it in Switzerland without any problem, independent of all the other countries. It even gives us a competitive advantage against the other countries. So it's no problem. So let's do this and not this basic income and not this discussion about something which is absolutely unrealistic, because nobody wants this international coordination.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because there is an important distinction, which I mentioned before, between the people who defend freedom and freedom for all, and then realize that in order to achieve freedom for all, it's important to have a tax system that is fair and that redistributes from all the peoples who gather these rents in a very unfair way because they happen to have the right sort of human capital and capital to co. And then there are the people who defend freedom only in order to defend the privileges of the rich. And they'll accuse any significant form of redistribution, which is only a fair distribution of what we've inherited, the possibilities inherited from the past, they'll describe that as slavery, as enslavement. This is a way of misusing freedom in order to defend the privileges of the rich.
Thank you, Philipp Löpfe, for the moderation. Thank you, Philippe Van Parijs, for tonight, but also for preparing for us younger unconditional basic income activists. Your preparational work is very valuable for us. And a very big thank you to Reiner Eichenberger. He knew when he would come here tonight that the mood in the room might be more towards favoring an unconditional basic income. So to come here under these circumstances, thank you very much. If your curiosity is still intact, I have 3 proposals for you.
In Switzerland, there is a cultural magazine called Do, and this current February issue deals with the future and also with the unconditional basic income. And any of you who want one, we put a lot of those outside by the aperitif. It's a gift for you. You can take one home if you want. The second option, if you're not sure if you like this idea of the unconditional basic income or not, go to www.bedingungslos.ch. You can answer 20 questions and the computer will tell you if you should vote yes or no. And the third option is that we can have a discussion outside. You're warmly invited to the aperitif. Thanks very much for coming.